thing I've ever been through.
George's wife, Tia, says she was asleep upstairs around midnight when she heard 2 gunshots. Her brother went outside.
And he said, just call 911. I said, what is it? Was somebody shot? He said, yes. And I said, who? And he said, George.
The family says they found George in a pool of blood on the front porch, his keys in the lock. Police say they can't find anyone who hurt a car, and there's no signs of robbery.
They said whoever did this may have been waiting for him, or maybe a gang initiation type thing. He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George.
43-year-old George Young was adored by everybody. He was a bodyguard to the stars with a nice demeanor and was extremely friendly. He was a hardworking husband and father to 3 boys. While coming home from work one day, he was shot dead as he was entering his home. A friend of his and his wife both heard 2 gunshots and rushed outside of the home, where they would tragically discover George on the porch suffering from gunshot wounds. Sadly, he was already dead when they arrived, and his door keys were still inside of the lock. Who would want to kill this loving father and husband? The search for the killer would reveal shocking lies, and the truth will devastate those closest to George. Welcome to Viral Crimes. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories. This story takes us to Beaufort, Georgia. George Young has been married to Tia Young for 22 years, and together they have 3 boys. George had his own security company where he provided armed security for high-profile celebrities, and he also installed security alarms under contract with Ackerman Security. He worked hard to support his family, working an average of 70 hours per week. He was able to provide his family with a nice home in a nice quiet neighborhood. George loved his wife and kids, and making sure his family was safe and well taken care of was his #1 priority. George had a kind heart and would help anyone in need. On November 16, 2017, George was working security for high-profile rapper Lil Yachty, who was launching his clothing line at the mall in Atlanta. George left the event and headed home after a long workday. As George placed his keys inside the door, gunshots rang out. His wife Tia, who was in her bedroom upstairs, heard the gunshots. The loud sounds alarmed her. She wasn't sure if it was gunshots or fireworks at first. Tia reports to the police that her brother Tim took his shotgun and went outside to look around, and the entire situation had her confused. She was unsure what was happening at the time. Sadly, Tim would enter the home and deliver Tia the most devastating news that she could ever hear. Her husband George was shot. They called 911, and police and paramedics raced to the home of the couple, but unfortunately, it was too late to save George. He was pronounced dead on the scene.
Developing this afternoon, the family of a murdered father says he was killed while coming home from working as a bodyguard. Police say someone shot him right on his front porch. Channel 2 Gwinnett County Bureau Chief Tony Thomas live at the home with a project the family says he planned to complete that could have helped solve his own murder. Tony.
Justin, the victim installed security cameras for a living on his house, just right up here under the roof line of the porch. You can see one just feet from where he was shot overnight, but that camera was not working. His family says he was just too busy taking care of his customers to work on his own house. His oldest son said he and his dad had talked about fixing the system just a few days ago. That's a conversation that will likely haunt that young man for a long time.
Because me and him, I talked about fixing one of the cameras that's in front of the house. Like a couple days prior, he asked me to possibly help him with that. And this happened. It's like, wow.
Dylan Young says he can't think of any reason someone would want to kill his 43-year-old father, George.
It's the hardest thing I've ever been through.
George's wife, Tia, says she was asleep upstairs around midnight when she heard 2 gunshots. Her brother went outside.
And he said, just call 911. I said, what is it? Was somebody shot? He said, yes. And I said, who? And he said, George.
The family says they found George in a pool of blood on the front porch, his keys in the lock. Police say they can't find anyone who hurt a car, and there's no signs of robbery.
They said whoever did this may have been waiting for him, or maybe a gang initiation type thing.
Young was working a side job Thursday night as a bodyguard for rapper Lil Yachty at Lenox Mall. Police say the job may be unrelated to the crime.
Lives jokes.
Yeah.
The family prays even though their camera wasn't working, maybe someone else's was, or at least somebody heard something.
He was a really good guy. Everybody loved George.
He says while he worked sometimes in executive protection, he did not carry a gun.
Looking at the crime scene, investigators immediately determined that this was a targeted attack. Many neighbors were shocked that a crime like this could take place in such a peaceful area. In a flash, the police rule out robbery as a motivation. They didn't steal anything since his phone, wallet, or anything else was still with him. The shell case is retrieved, but no weapon was discovered. Detectives turned to the individuals who lived in the home. No one had any information that could help investigators. Authorities informed George's sister, Ivy, that her brother had been murdered. His sister and the rest of his family lived in South Carolina. Within a few hours, she was driving to Georgia and contacting Tia to try to gain clarification about what happened to her brother. Tia informed her that the police believed it to be a case of mistaken identity, maybe part of a gang initiation. This was confusing to George's sister because George lived in a pretty lovely, peaceful area, and she would never expect something so horrible to happen in his neighborhood. She felt completely safe every time she visited him. As authorities continued their investigation, they couldn't find anyone who had anything bad to say about George. People described him as a person who would go above and beyond for everyone. He was such a kind person. He did nothing but work hard. From very early in the morning till late at night, he worked. Police immediately questioned if George's employment providing protection for celebrities may be connected to the murder. They wondered if anything occurred at his workplace that evening with the rapper Lil Yachty. Had someone followed him home after he got into a fight? It really didn't seem at all random to investigators. However, after a few calls to his coworkers, they concluded that none of that was the case. So, why would somebody want to assassinate George Young? The devoted husband and father of 3 was shot and killed on his front doorstep by a cold-blooded murderer, and the police had no suspects. The theory about George being killed by gang initiation was actually brought up by George's wife the day after he was killed. Tia told George's sister Ivy the same story. George's sister Ivy believed her sister-in-law's theory about the murder, but detectives were not convinced, and they never told Tia that they believed it was gang-related. Tia would continue to provide explanations that would cause people to scratch their heads. Police questioned Tia and her brother Tim Lee the night of the murder. When George was slain, they were both in the home. Investigators noticed that their stories didn't match up, and they also noticed that when Tia first called 911, she informed the operator that she believed the noise outside to be fireworks, since her neighbors often fired them off. Investigators wondered why she would call 911 if she believed the noise to be fireworks that her neighbors often set off. Cops weren't the only ones who were beginning to have more suspicion for Tia. George's sister also grew suspicious of Tia. After 6 hours of traveling from South Carolina, George's sister Ivy anticipated seeing Tia in a state of emotional collapse when she got to his home, but she asserts that what she really discovered wasn't a grieving widow at all. When she arrived at George and Tia's home, Tia gave her a hug and said, "Hey," with no tears or anything else in her voice. This was very strange to George's sister because she was around Tia when Tia's father passed, and she saw Tia distraught and crying continuously. Ivy reports that nobody seemed unhappy at her brother's home. Everyone seemed to be on vacation, like George was not just murdered on the front steps of the home. There was no mourning. When Ivy watched the story on the local news, she saw that the news outlet referred to Tim as Tia's brother. George's sister knew that Tia didn't have any brothers, and Tim was not a brother. She also stated that Tim answered Tia's phone when she was trying to reach Tia regarding the details of her brother's death, and that this was disturbing to her. She questioned who it was answering Tia's phone. Tim explained to Ivy who he was, and that George found out that Tim lost his job, so he let him work for his security company, and when he found out that he was struggling and living out of motels, he invited him to come stay with him and his wife and kids. Ivy was familiar with Tim. They grew up in the same town as her and her brother George. They were never close to Tim. She viewed Tim as quiet and rather odd. Authorities brought both Tim and Tia in for questioning 2 days after the murder, and this is when detectives discovered that they were not really related. Tia informs police that Tim isn't actually her brother, which is one of the major revelations. He was merely a friend of the family looking for a place to live. That was a major turning point for investigators. This coupled with the fact that their versions of what happened that night kept changing. From the Youngs' neighbor next door came a bombshell. Investigators received a call from the Youngs' next-door neighbors while Tia and Tim were being interviewed. The next-door neighbor said that he looked out his window as soon as he heard gunshots that evening and saw what he thought to be Tim. He was sprinting from George's Lincoln Navigator that was parked in the driveway to the Youngs' house. According to the neighbor, after seeing the guy take something out of the SUV, he ran inside the home. Tim was questioned about it when detectives entered the interrogation room again. They asked him did he ever go out to the vehicle for any reason, to which he responded, "I was taking the tracker off the vehicle." Tim states that George instructed him to install a GPS tracker on his truck so that, in the unlikely event that anything were to happen to him, they could still locate the vehicle. But why was he in such a hurry to take the tracker off the vehicle if George had really requested him to do so? He explained that he was acting on instinct because he wanted to keep George safe. He stated that he didn't want his friends or family to know that George had been trafficking weapons from Florida to North Carolina and that one of the participants had come looking for him. According to Tim, that person had visited them at home and informed Tia that George owed him money. When Tia was questioned by the police, she didn't have a clue what Tim was talking about. Investigators spoke to George's sister again, and she informed them of a life insurance policy her brother and Tia had at one point. Tia had only hours earlier informed the police that she didn't think a life insurance policy existed. Tia claimed she thought all life insurance policies had lapsed. They quickly learned that George and Tia had a $1 million life insurance policy, and Tia was the sole beneficiary. Despite Tia claiming that she thought the policies were no longer active, they learned that she called to start processing the life insurance policy within 24 hours of her husband's murder. Investigators realized that with all of the commotion at the home the day of George's murder, the kids never woke up. Investigators conducted searches while moving in and out of rooms, including the room of the children. There were several loud conversations going on. There were several individuals present at the home, including the medical examiner, fire vehicles, ambulances, police, CSI photographers, and neighbors who were walking by, and the kids never woke up. They discovered that the reason is because Tia gave her children sleeping pills. Tim and Tia became the main suspects in George's murder. And not only in the eyes of investigators. Ivy also believed that Tim and Tia killed her brother, and she told her sister-in-law that. According to police, Tim was following George's every move the night he was killed using a GPS tracker he installed on his vehicle and an app on his phone, which told investigators that only he could have known when he was returning home. Investigations also turned up what they believed to be a second reason for George's murder, in addition to the life insurance money. Tia no longer wanted to be with George. Regardless of what she told police. Tia and George's marriage, according to friends and relatives, was in trouble. And her phone contained plenty of evidence to support that. The messages Tia and Tim exchanged were highly passionate. They were very sexual in nature. They were things you would send to your spouse or wife, your lover or girlfriend, but most certainly not to your brother. In April, he and Tia were taken back into police headquarters for interrogation as evidence against them grew. The police inquired about their relationship right away. They placed the evidence of the explicit emails they sent to each other right in front of Tia. They wanted to let her know that they were aware of their relationship. Tia admitted to having a relationship with Tim, but claimed they stopped the affair after the murder. Tim, unlike Tia, refused to make any admissions. He immediately requested a lawyer when asked about his relationship with Tia. Tim and Tia were arrested and then charged with the murder of George. Police say that he and Tia planned to murder George in order to get George's life insurance payout and to be together. They believe that Tia was only pretending to be grieving in her TV interviews. Tim and Tia both entered a not guilty plea in court. They were jailed until their trial since the court denied their request for bail.
She once cried in front of television cameras after her husband was killed, and now she is on trial for his murder. George Young was shot and killed on his front porch after coming home from work one night in Gwinnett County. We covered this story extensively. Prosecutors believe his wife and a friend were having an affair and killed him for his $1 million insurance policy. Before she was charged in the crime, we spoke to Tia Young as she pleaded for justice in the case, flanked by her children.
I'm gonna do it by myself. Everybody loved George.
Well, a sharp contrast to that portrayal the prosecution painted in court today. 11 Alive's Latasha Givens was there.
So many people felt for this wife as they watched her cry on television cameras about her husband's murder. But today in court, it was the couple's close friend who says Tia Young and her co-defendant both began acting oddly right after Young's death.
That's hearsay. Judge, I'm going to object. Objection, Your Honor.
This is how the murder trial of George Young began.
He's eliciting hearsay statements.
The defense not holding back on the state's first witness, Young's former boss and friend, Rob Strickland.
He was my go-to guy.
Young's wife, Tia Young, and the couple's live-in friend, Harvey Timothy Lee, are accused of killing him for a $1 million insurance policy. Investigators believe Tia and Lee were having an affair and conspired to murder Young. Strickland's wife and defendant Tia are cousins. Strickland says Tia called them moments after Young was shot. Strickland testified he felt the defendants acted suspiciously when he came to the family's home soon after. He stated while the crime scene tape was still up, Lee talked about sending the children to school the next day, and Tia asked if he would help her find Young's insurance policy. Strickland also testified he noticed the home security camera was not connected. He says that was odd considering George Young worked as a security guard and had his own employees. Thursday afternoon, the prosecution played Tia's 911 call.
I just heard a gunshot.
In the call, she refers to the co-defendant as her brother. And she tells the 911 dispatcher she doesn't want police to come with lights and sirens because she didn't want to wake up her kids.
Okay, they're going to come lights and sirens due to the severity of the issue.
Former crime scene investigator Jordan Drum was called to the stand next. The defense questioned if the crime scene was truly secure, refuting a checklist that may not have included everyone on the scene. And the defense also questioned why a photographer with the show The First 48 was allowed near the crime scene. Then they expressed concerns about the jurors having open lunch around the courthouse where they could potentially hear attorneys talking about the case. That's something Judge Tracy Mason acknowledged and may change when trial resumes tomorrow. In Gwinnett County, I'm Latasha Givens, 11 Alive News.
Tia did not receive any of the life insurance money. When the insurance company found out she was a suspect, they withheld the funds and refused to release them until they wait to see what happens in court. George and Tia's 3 boys have been living with Tia's mother ever since their mother's incarceration. Tia does not let Ivy see her nephews anymore because she accused her of murder. On April 6, a jury returned a verdict. Young was found guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault and 2 counts of criminal attempt to tamper with evidence. Lee was convicted of malice murder, felony murder and aggravated assault.
Number 2 this week, the woman found guilty of killing her husband to cash in on life insurance money will find out how long she will spend in prison. A jury found Tia Young guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault, and 2 counts of criminal attempt to tamper with evidence. Her alleged lover, Harvey Timothy Lee, was convicted of malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. Tia's husband, George Young, was shot and killed on his front porch after coming home from work in November of 2017. Sentencing will be held on Thursday.
On April 11th, the 2 were sentenced. Lee will serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. Young was sentenced to life plus 3 years, but does have the possibility of parole. What happened to George Young was beyond tragic. He worked extremely hard to make sure his family was taken care of. He loved and trusted his wife, and she betrayed him. He thought he was helping a friend by employing him and giving him a place to stay, and this friend also betrayed him. George was a great man and didn't deserve what happened to him. I'm sure he never thought that with all of the possible dangers he faced on the job working security, the real danger would be right under his own roof. My condolences to his friends and family. May you find some way to heal from your pain. Thanks for watching and I will see you in the next video.